Hi everyone, we're back. Welcome back. We're going to start over. Just several more people have signed on since we left, and then for all the people who could not hear us at the beginning, I think it'll just be a good idea for us to start from the beginning. So apologies. We're going to do the intro again, and then we'll get started right away. So thanks again to everyone for joining our next webinar. We wanted to welcome back all of you who have been here in our previous webinars for Clean Power Plan issues. And we wanted to welcome new attendees for joining us. My name is Needy Stanton, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today's topic is on renewables integration and the Clean Power Plan. Here with me today are two authors of Synapse's newly released report, A Solved Problem, Existing Measures Provide Low-Cost Wind and Solar Integration. Patrick Lukow is a senior associate here at Synapse. He's an expert in electricity systems modeling and renewables integration, and he's been extensively thinking about lots of different aspects related to the Clean Power Plan, both in its proposed form as well as the final rule. Dr. Tommy Vitolo is a senior associate here at Synapse as well, and he's an expert in costs and benefits of distributed generation and utility and municipal electricity resource planning. The goal of their report and our webinar today is to essentially debunk the myth that challenges to integrating additional renewable energy on the grid are not manageable. And really, on the contrary, we collectively have a wide range of existing technological and non-technological solutions and really opportunities to realize increased renewable penetration without much disruption. Patrick will be covering an overview of the issues and will provide detail on some of the technical issues involved in integrating renewables. Then Tommy will discuss information about integration costs. The way today's webinar is going to work is that the speakers will present for about a half an hour, and we'll devote the rest of the time, the hour, to question and answers. A few notes about logistics first. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to all attendees along with the slides. All attendees have actually been muted on our end as well and will remain muted throughout the webinar. We don't want this to discourage asking questions, though. We want your questions, and so we've set up an email, webinar@synapseenergy.com, for all attendees to email questions as you have them throughout the presentation. During the Q&A session, then, the panelists will be answering your written questions that have been sent to this email. You can use the chat feature within your WebEx screen to notify the host if you're having any technical issues, though, with either audio or WebEx software, and we'll help resolve those for you in real time. And finally, a quick note about Synapse. I know many of you on the list know about Synapse, but for those of you who are new, we were founded in 1996 by CEO Bruce Bewald. Since then, we've grown to be a leader in public interest and government clients, providing rigorous analysis of mostly electric power system issues. Our staff is about 30, and it includes experts in energy and environmental economics and environmental compliance issues. And today's webinar is being sponsored by the Environment, Economics, and Society Institute. We want to thank them for their support. They are a newly established nonprofit committed to supporting economic and environmental research in the public interest. Their goals are really to support and disseminate research on climate change and committing resources. They commit their resources to raising awareness of environmental, economic, and climate issues. With that, I think I will pass the ball over to Patrick, who will begin his portion of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Needy. Why don't we just dive right in to set the context for some of us. thinking about renewable energy in terms of the Clean Power Plan. In target setting for the recently released Clean Power Plan final rule, the EPA assumptions assumed a quadrupling of renewable energy production by 2030 from 2012 levels. Most of that came from wind, about 70%, and a big chunk of it came from solar as well. These numbers aren't final by any means. This is just the targets. There's a lot of flexibility in the Clean Power Plan, but all signs point to a significant expansion of renewable energy in the next 5, 10, 15 years. There's a lot of uncertainty, talk, questions about what sort of challenges this poses to the grid. So that's what we're going to dive into today. I'm going to start by talking about what makes renewable energy different, then go into how we can manage some of these challenges and differences, and then I'm going to transition it over to Tommy Vitolo to talk about some of the costs of that integration. So, how is renewable energy different? Wind and solar, as you all I'm sure know, fluctuate throughout the day. The important difference from conventional technologies being they are not, at least as we conventionally think about it, under the whims of the dispatch operators for how the power system operates. What the figure I'm showing here is PJM's renewable dashboard, where they show the actual wind generation as compared to the wind forecast. And you can see it's a pretty good forecast. Wind forecasts have gotten much better in the last few years, but there's still work to be done. On this is from yesterday afternoon, and you can see a widening gap between the two forecasts, the forecast and the actual generation at 12 p.m. to the tune of maybe 1,000 megawatts in some hours. So this is a significant fluctuation just caused by the wind starting to blow a little earlier than people anticipated. And that's going to require some changing operations, some additional reserves to think about how to balance that uncertainty in the minute-to-minute time frame. This is another chart I just wanted to bring up briefly. This is the California duck, as you've heard it referred to. This is the net load shape, which is the load, the actual demand minus the generation from wind and solar, resulting in a bunch of future years. And that's the key takeaway that I wanted to show here is this net load shape is changing pretty significantly as we go from today to 2020 and beyond. The increasing penetration of wind and solar in particular here, causes the net loads to drop significantly in the middle of the day as solar production is higher, and then the increasing demand requirements in general cause the peak to go up without being compensated by the solar because it's falling off in the shoulder hours. So that creates a different shape that system planners and operators have to deal with than what they're used to. And that poses some challenges. What I've got on the next slide is just a simplified representative dispatch chart to show a couple of those key challenges. I'll talk about them in a little more detail on the next slide, but I just wanted to demonstrate visually what these challenges mean. So one of the key issues is minimum loads. Fossil plants cannot operate linearly from 0 to 100% of their nameplate capacity. They have some minimum operating level, and those pose a constraint on the system. You can't go below that level without finding other alternatives to use that power because supply and demand have to be constantly matching. The other major issue here is ramping requirements, which you can see from hours about 15 to 19 in this chart. The gas generation in the brownish gray color ramps up rapidly as the solar generation is falling. And this is a necessary supply and demand balance that we just have to make sure that flexibility is existing on the grid at all hours when it's necessary. So what are those two issues in a little more detail? The thermal power plants have minimum operating levels typically between 40 and 60% of their maximum capacity. They ramp up to that level after they've been turned on and can't operate below that level other than being shut down. This is due to thermal and mechanical constraints. Temperatures can't get too high. There's pollutant emission limits beyond just CO2 that would be exceeded if they were operating below those levels. So these really pose a constraint on those power plants and then the system as a whole, as there's a large number of those power plants on the grid. The other major issue is ramping availability, both upwards and downwards. We need sufficient capacity that can increase its output at a rapid rate. The timing of that rate varies. We could be talking about as little as 5 or 10 minutes, or it could be an hour ramp or a 3-hour ramp, which is kind of what we were looking at on the previous slide, where you have a few hours when you know the solar generation is going to drop and you have to balance that. To some extent, it's a function of the level of capacity that's online at any given moment. Plants that are dispatched at less than their maximum capability have more ramping capability. If you're online at 75% of your maximum, you can ramp up to 100% of your maximum. And the speed of that ramp depends on a number of mechanical and thermal, again, constraints of the specific power plant. And some types of generation are much better at that than others. And new plants in general are much better at this than older steam power plants, which just have a lot of inertia and weren't designed to operate in the manner that power plants in the future are going to need to operate. So how do we manage these constraints? One of the key low-hanging fruit areas that we found is just increasing cooperation, getting people across the country to talk to each other and better understand how their systems are working and make them work together. This is done to a limited extent today. There's a lot of momentum to do it on a much finer level of temporal detail. The chart I'm showing here is from a PJM proposal for something that's called coordinated transaction scheduling, which is really just, in the simplest terms, getting the neighboring independent system operators to talk to each other and reduce the differences in prices at the interfaces between the systems. So this is between PJM and the New York ISO and ISO New England, where there can be some significant differences at those seams between the systems. In the West, they're also doing this. The energy imbalance market exists today. It's driven by CAISO, and Pacificor is also a member, and there are a number of neighboring utilities that are also members or planning on joining in the near future, from Nevada Energy to Puget Sound Energy. The list goes on. The energy imbalance market is an important tool that allows neighboring systems to balance supply and demand on a very short time period. It's meant for 15-minute scheduling, so when you see some level of shift in supply and demand on that real-time schedule, you use this market to balance it in an automatic way. These utilities still operate independently on the day ahead, so they commit their systems as they find best for them the day beforehand, and then if they run into any issues in the real time, they can adjust with the broader system. And we found that this level of coordination can help all these systems manage an increasing level of wind and solar energy. The next item that really helps to make it easier to manage variable renewable energy is geographic diversity. This is just a representative chart that compares the output from a single wind turbine to a wind farm or many wind farms spread out over a wide geographic area. And all this does is balance and average out those rapid fluctuations that can be caused by local or broader weather patterns that could significantly affect the output of a single turbine. What you see here is that the peaks are dampened a lot. The ramps required to balance the changes in those peaks are much softer and slower. So this just becomes a much simpler challenge for system operators to deal with when you don't have these big ups and downs. A recent LBNL study looked at this in a more quantitative fashion and found that it was particularly valuable for wind energy, and it increased with increasing penetration, and they quantified it as a value of up to $10 per megawatt hour. So this geographic diversity has a real benefit in making systems more cost-effective to manage. There's a few other simple things that I just wanted to mention. At conventional power plants, you can do some simple retrofits to increase the flexibility and reduce the minimum operating levels. One of the ancillary benefits of these types of retrofits is as you increase the flexibility, you probably reduce the number of times the plant needs to shut down entirely, so you reduce the number of starts, which can impose a real cost on the system. You can also do better work at control centers or in the planning phases of a power system. One of the key points that we've looked at is doing a better job of thinking about your long-term contracts for specific resources. If you have a must-run contract even for a conventional resource, that's also posing a constraint on your system because you need to take that out of all hours. Similarly, people who have ownership shares in a power plant but limited dispatch control, who are constrained to just take what the power plant outputs. There are ways that these planning organizations should be thinking about structuring those contracts to better manage wind and solar resources. Transmission investments are another key area. They can allow for better inter-area cooperation, as I talked about earlier. You can import or export more energy in the hours when wind and solar gets harder to manage, maybe is bumping up against your minimum load to the extent that you can export it to a neighboring system. A number of studies have found that reduces the cost of integration significantly. And then at the load center is one more place where you can make this easier. Demand response is a rapidly improving technology. Demand response products have gotten much more automated in the last few years, so system operators can use them as a low-cost resource, not only for meeting the peakiest of the peak hours, but for providing reserves to balance the uncertainty of wind and solar energy. And the other area is time of use rates, which can help flatten the net load curve that we were looking at before. You can increase the minimum load by reducing prices in those hours and then reduce the peaks. And this, a flatter load shape reduces the incidence of those large ramps that become a challenge for conventional generation and even the new flexible gas turbines to deal with. So this is an outline of the simple and existing measures that people can do to manage these resources. The big takeaway here is these are things that are already being done today, and people have a good understanding of what needs to be done. To dig into more of the costs in dollars per megawatt hour of this level of integration challenge, I'm going to pass it off to Tommy now.
Good afternoon, folks. I hope you can hear me. Again, my name is Tommy Vitolo. A quick friendly reminder, if you've got questions, we might have answers. Send them to webinar@synapseenergy.com, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And I'll speak a little faster, so maybe we can get to a few more. So first I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you what I told you. we're going to start with actual costs because, at least for the nerds like me, a good chart can really help shake off the mid-presentation doldrums. And then we're going to talk about what's in the study, what costs are included, what costs are excluded, and finally, we'll have a look at sensitivities. To what factors or parameters are the results sensitive? And again, then we're going to get into some questions. So without further ado, roll that beautiful integration cost footage. So what are we looking at? The x-axis is wind penetration, and those parentheses matter. So what we're measuring is the nameplate capacity of wind in the study area divided by the total system capacity. And with the exception maybe of the CAISO 2015 study, most of these studies are old enough where PV is little to none of that system capacity. So really, we're talking about wind divided by, loosely speaking, hydro plus fossil plus nuclear. And that's important because we actually do it a little bit differently with solar. You see these numbers range from a couple of percent to almost 50%, and the prices don't change much. Hey, look, it turns out that, at least with the studies we looked at, the cost of integrating wind is not particularly sensitive to how much wind you're integrating. Now, maybe at levels above 50%, we'll see a bend in that trend, but at least to a first approximation, $5 a megawatt hour is an awfully good guess, unless you're Idaho. Idaho came up with much higher costs, and that might be because the particulars of their study are a little bit different, or it might be because Idaho is a little bit different. In fact, they had a few challenges that some of these other study areas don't have. Number one, they're a small system, and they're not very well interconnected, as is the case of much of the West, in fact. Secondly, they've got a number of hydro units and a number of coal units that they cannot use to help integrate the wind, either because they are run-of-river or because they only own a fraction of the plant and have no say on that plant's dispatch. And so Idaho didn't have as many resources to integrate the wind, and sure enough, they found costs are higher. The two takeaways are, again, hey, $5 a megawatt hour for as much as 50% wind seems to be the findings of an awful lot of studies. And, well, if you don't have resources that can help you integrate, or more specifically, if you have a number of resources on your system that preclude you from integrating, you may find substantially higher costs. Let's look at solar. Roughly the same story. Under $5, we see from a few percent up to 30%, and not as many studies. We'd like to see some more and see if this trend holds true. It's important to note that on the x-axis, the metric is slightly different. It's still nameplate, but instead of dividing by total generation, it's actually dividing by peak load. I don't have a good, to cut off the question, I don't have a good answer as to why the wind studies tended to use system capacity and the solar studies tend to use peak load, but that's what they do. Similar to the wind study, we did have some outlier. In this case, the outlier is Tucson, Arizona, and it's perhaps for a very similar reason. It's a relatively small utility. They have lots of coal co-ownership, so again, they can't use it to help integrate. More to follow. Now that we've shown you what the costs are and get that out of the way, $5 a megawatt hour is a good approximation. Let's talk about what costs we're talking about. This definition comes out of a national laboratory, and I think it's a really good one. Wind and solar integration costs are costs incurred in operational timeframes that can be attributed to the variability and uncertainty introduced by wind and solar generation. This image is courtesy of CAISO, and it describes dispatch on different time frames. And so there's a day-ahead schedule where resources are primed and ready to go. As you may know, many steam resources need a day's notice just to make sure that they're ready. And as we get closer and closer to now, hour ahead, 15 minutes ahead, we fine-tune our estimate of what load will be, and we use resources to make up that relatively small difference. And then as we get into the 1 minute, we use even more resources to regulate, to make sure that our supply is exactly meeting our demand. And so when we do these studies, what we're asking is, because of the variability and uncertainty introduced by wind and solar generation, how does the cost associated with the resources used for this operational behavior different? How does it get more expensive? That's what we're after. So the kinds of costs we're talking about are costs associated with temporal variations, regulation and load following, making sure that at that minute-by-minute level, we really are putting just as much power on the grid as our customers are demanding, given that we now have to also balance the variability and uncertainty associated with wind and solar. To the extent that we need additional operating reserves, spinning, non-spinning, or even supplemental, those additional operating reserve costs would be included. The difference in unit commitment costs. If there are more startups and shutdowns, not of the wind and solar units, but of the coal units, of the gas units, the costs associated with that startup and shutdown, which is typically included in 8760 security-constrained economic dispatch models, would be accounted for. And so this so-called wear and tear, yeah, that actually is typically already in the models, and it should be. Day-ahead fuel procurement. This is really more an issue for gas units, not so much for coal or nuclear. Many gas units procure capacity in the pipeline day ahead. Before intermittent renewables, it was much easier to know just how much gas your gas generators would need, and they procure that much. Well, now, because of the intermittency and the variability, we may require our gas units to procure more gas capacity than they end up needing. And that additional capacity they procure, even if they don't use it, if they procure it because of variability and uncertainty, it's a cost. It should be included. Difference in generating costs. Most differences in generating costs don't belong in integration studies, but here's an example of one that does. Before the wind and solar, we would have dispatched Unit A, which is a coal unit, and it has a cost of $40 a megawatt hour. But it turns out that it doesn't ramp very well. It can't be helpful in integrating. And now that we have some wind on our system or some solar on our system, if we dispatch Unit A, we don't have the resources to integrate that wind and solar. So instead of dispatching Unit A, we dispatch Unit B, a gas unit, which is, say, $60 a megawatt hour. Well, now there's a difference in generating costs associated directly with the variability and uncertainty introduced by wind and solar. And that difference, that $20 difference, is associated with integration costs and reasonably should be included. Line loss, variation, and hurdle rates, again, to the extent that we used Unit B instead of Unit A, and there's a difference in line loss, that line loss variation, not all the line losses on the system, but just that variation is associated with integration costs and should be included. If we incur more hurdle rates by exporting power out of our balancing area or importing more power in, that increase in hurdle cost should also be included. So what's not included? Capital costs. The costs of constructing our wind turbines or our solar panels, the CTs for the additional ramping, the cost saved by avoiding a fossil retrofit and simply retiring it, any change in transmission infrastructure costs. None of those costs are included in an integration study. They're important costs. We should think very carefully about those costs. We should do resource planning. We should do regional planning. But those costs aren't part of an integration cost. Those are a different cost. Similarly, operating costs that are not the result of the variability and uncertainty are not included. And so the difference, the savings, because you're paying $0 a megawatt hour for solar or wind instead of $60 a megawatt hour for some fossil unit, that savings in energy cost, that's not included. That's a different cost. The system-wide line losses, not that delta we talked about, but just the general losses and the general use of ancillary services, those are not included. And the way that we typically see those costs included is by modeling the system twice, once without the intermittent renewables and once with. And when we subtract the cost of the latter from the cost of the former, whatever costs are less, whether or not they're directly attributable to the variability and uncertainty, are considered the integration costs. Divide by the generation in megawatt hours of our wind and solar, and that's how we get our dollars per megawatt hour number. But let's think about, for just a moment, what can drive this dollar per megawatt hour number up or down? Or it's reasonable to ask, does the penetration of intermittent resources drive that number? That is, if we have more and more wind and solar, does the cost go up? Well, recall what I opened with. Recall the two charts, one for wind and one for solar, and those yellow highlighted boxes that had a very slight upward slope. It turns out that, at least according to the studies we've seen, for penetration less than 50% for wind and, say, 35% for solar, that in fact the integration costs are not particularly sensitive to the penetration of intermittent resources. There are outliers, right? We saw Tucson and Idaho where it was much more sensitive. And so, again, we'll harp on this at the very end, you got to do your own study. You've got to make sure that you're accounting for your own issues. But for most of the studies, penetration is not a driver. What is a driver is natural gas price forecast. As gas goes up, price of gas goes up, the price of integration goes up. And so that might sound like, well, that's bad news. I'd remind you, though, that if the price of gas goes up, the savings associated with generating from wind or solar instead of natural gas are about 10 times bigger than the integration costs themselves. So as the price of gas goes up, even though the integration costs go up, wind and solar become more attractive in overall cost. Excuse me. 3 studies looked at hydro. Sure enough, those 3 areas have quite a bit of hydro on their system, and it makes sense. Hey, if you're relying a lot on hydro, include that in your study. If you don't have a lot of hydro, you don't need to worry so much about that sensitivity. Transmission showed up in a number, and for good reason. Idaho did something particularly interesting, I thought. Idaho asked the question, if we build this particular 500 kV line from Boardman, what does that do to our integration costs? And so they studied an actual potential investment that turned out to reduce their integration costs by about 10%, a single transmission line. That's probably not a good enough reason in and of itself to build it, but it's certainly interesting information to know and help make that decision one way or the other. A number of studies looked at reserve requirements to try to better understand how those reserve requirements were driving the costs. They studied all kinds of different sensitivities, so I don't think we can take any one thing from those studies, except it's interesting to ask the question, if we change our reserve requirements in some particular way, how does that change our costs? For solar integration cost sensitivities, we have fewer sensitivities and fewer studies. Penetration, of course, is looked at, and again, we don't see a very sensitive result, except as we saw for Tucson. Natural gas price forecast, again, folks are very interested in how a different price of natural gas affects the integration costs. I think it's probably interesting but not very informative because, again, as the price of natural gas goes up, these intermittent resources become more valuable to economic dispatch, relatively speaking, and that's, again, by about an order of magnitude more than the additional costs associated with integration. So interesting to know, but I don't think it's going to really help drive very many decisions. A couple of folks looked at reserve requirements again, and I think it's important to think about reserve requirements, and I hope that the larger regulating authorities continue to think about it. As we have more intermittent resources, maybe our traditional reserve margins aren't the right way to think about it. And maybe we do need to have a reserve margin that is a function of the amount of wind and solar on our system and the way that it tends to dispatch in our system. So there's plenty of room, I think, there for really studying reliability. At the end of the day, we see wind and solar integration costs are about $5 a megawatt hour, half a cent a kilowatt hour. And remember, these costs represent the incremental costs due to variability and uncertainty incurred while balancing the grid. The sensitivities, different physical futures matter, right? So as your generation is going to change, as your transmission is going to change, both in your system and your neighbors, those are the kinds of sensitivities that make a lot of sense to me to think about. When you do your own study, $5 a megawatt hour is a great off-the-cuff number, but if you're doing actual planning for your actual system, it might be worth taking the time to do a study that considers the specifics of your generation, of your load, of your transmission, both now and how you expect it to change in the future, while including your neighbors. Because, as Patrick mentioned, the better you work with your neighbors, the lower your integration costs and other costs are going to be. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Needy, and she can tell us a little bit about the Synapse Clean Power Plan Toolkit.
Thanks, Tommy and Patrick. That was fantastic. It was a great overview, a lot of good information about your report. I want to encourage everybody to send in questions to the webinar at synapseenergy.com email address. We've definitely had a few roll in, but we have room for more. And we want to pick the brains of these two experts as much as we can in the next 17 minutes. So please send questions in as you have them. We're on the Synapse Clean Power Plan Toolkit slide now, and I just wanted to quickly mention many of you already have used Synapse before. We've worked with you. But for those of you who are new, Synapse has been developing for quite some time now different components of a toolkit to provide clean power plan analysis. And it is being updated as we speak for changes in the final rule as of 3 weeks ago. And you can find out a lot more about it on our website. I don't want to take any more time away from Q&A. But you can't go to our website and not see this diagram. So please go to it and click around if you are interested, and contact information for anybody to get in touch with about the different components will be there as well. The next slide is just about related resources to this webinar, as well as clean power plan analysis capabilities of Synapse. Patrick and Tommy's report is on our website, but also is a really nice, quick 2-page fact sheet that goes into the highlights of the report is available, and then a slew of resources about our past webinars, blog posts on Clean Power Plan. It's pretty much been Clean Power Plan here day and night, so we have a lot of resources available for everybody to look at. And then finally, we wanted to have you stay tuned into our next webinars. This webinar is part of a series of webinars related to Clean Power Plan final ruling. And on September 3rd, we'll be talking about modeling the final rule, and then September 8th, tentatively, we'll be talking to updates to Synapse's CP3T tool, which is a very nice comprehensive screening tool for Clean Power Plan compliance for states. And then the last slide just provides contact information for today's speakers. Any questions that we either don't get to today or you think of after we finish, Patrick and Tommy would love to hear from you and answer any additional questions you have. So with that, we'll start on our first question that came in, which actually kind of goes back to the beginning of the presentation. So this, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but we started to talk about renewables integration in the context of Clean Power Plan. That is a very long-term ruling where we're dealing with the next, the 2020 to 2022 to 2030 timeframe. But a lot of these renewables integration issues and challenges, but also opportunities, are available right now, and we've been talking about them either now, but then in the context of something longer. So can you kind of distill for us how these issues are a matter of things that are important today versus things that are happening in the future?
Yeah, this is Patrick. I can take a stab at that. So renewable energy is projected to grow a lot by 2030, but yeah, has also grown quite substantially over the last 5 years, and over the next few years, most folks expect that trend to continue. A lot of the measures I outlined in my portion of the presentation are already being done today, and in the form they're being done today are pretty good for accommodating the forecasts of renewable energy that people would expect over the next several years. Most of what we're hearing talked about in planning dockets and utilities that are struggling, thinking about this, is the next phase of renewable development. So maybe 5, 6, 7 years down the line, how do we plan for a system that's really going to have these big swings on the system? In the California duck chart I showed, the peak of that chart was in 2020. So we've got a few years to get to that point, and the tools under the control of most system operators today seem like they're sufficient for most challenges. Granted, we have seen negative prices in several jurisdictions across the country, but a lot of those are related to other constraints, transmission bottlenecks, and that sort of thing. So we'll continue to address that and plan for the future where it starts to pose bigger challenges.
I would just add, this is Tommy, that we also are seeing at least the RTOs and ISOs work toward better integration both with each other and also in terms of more finely tuning their dispatch. And we see in CAISO, SPP has done some great work there. Anything an ISO or an RTO can do to reduce the amount of time between commands, to coordinate better with load, with generators, with neighbors, makes integration less costly. And we're seeing RTOs and ISOs work on some of those items now. We expect they will continue. It's less clear to me personally if we will see those utilities that are not part of ISOs and RTOs push that envelope a little bit. It can be a little bit more difficult for them, perhaps, either because of size or because they don't have a larger organization helping them along. But there is a real risk, at least in my mind, that the utilities that are not participating in a larger transmission organization or system operator may not drive down their costs as quickly as those who are participating, and that would be a missed opportunity.
Thanks. So, Tommy, you just mentioned size of a system again, and Patrick, you had mentioned your duck curve again. Not your duck curve, the CAISO duck curve. Can you give us a sense of what that duck curve looks like in other larger ISOs?
I'm not sure. Hawaii certainly has a duck curve, but they're a much smaller system, and of course it's a series of electrical islands. But for larger territories, I don't know that any other area is expecting that much PV to come on relative to spring load that creates that sort of arch in the back the way the California duck
Yeah, I haven't really seen the parallel chart elsewhere. One factor might be that system operators in the middle or eastern fraction of the country are thinking about a little more wind than solar as opposed to the balance that California is thinking about, which creates different load shape impacts.
Mm-hmm. So, but if you were to project, so what it could look like if it was a larger, in a larger system, we might see a slightly tempered neck.
Maybe, but I'd do a little bit of geography, right? So the sun sets in the west. Can't get farther west on the mainland than California. For everyone else, solar panels west of their balancing authority can produce electricity for them at the so-called duck head, simply import energy from west to east to alleviate that problem. The rest of the country is fortunate to have California west of it in that regard.
Thanks. So the next set of questions is about technologies. And the first one is, of course, one of the, the elephants in the room, and it's a question about the Tesla utility scale battery and what significance that has in renewables integration, particularly at the costs that they were citing.
I haven't thought particularly about the cost side of things, but storage is definitely an important resource for meeting both sides of the challenge. The minimum load side, where storage can consume energy when it's really, really cheap, and the peak hours. And we've seen system planners starting to think about better ways to dispatch storage that can best manage these needs. I think it's a really promising resource, and we'll just have to see how the technology costs shake out.
Yeah, this is Tommy. The Tesla battery is an example of demand-side storage, which I think is really important to think about differently than grid storage made up mostly of pumped hydro. And when we're talking about demand-side storage, we can also think about any other shift in demand related to grid operations. And so storage is one way to think about it. Another is that button on your dishwasher that says started in 6 hours. That's maybe an old school version. Nest is a newer version, Google's thermostat. But any time that the customer is shifting the electrons that it pulls from or even pushes to the grid, be it through storage or some other technology, it's a tremendous opportunity if the utility can figure out how to harness it to help integration tremendously. I've sort of been using the phrase demand response, right? You tell people to charge their cars or heat their electric water heaters when all the renewables are online, sort of in California at noon with the sun shining, maybe in Nebraska when the wind's blowing. Rocky Mountain Institute just came out with a report or a study where they use the phrase flexi-watts to sort of mean the same thing. When the customer can change its demand, not without suffering any consequences, but in a way that helps integrate resources on the grid, we may see tremendous savings. And the Tesla battery is one of many opportunities to do that I think we'll start seeing flourish, I don't know, 5 years from now?
How often is storage considered as part of, explicitly considered in the integration cost studies?
Well, it's not a cost that would go into an integration cost study because it's capital.
It's the excluded.
Right,
Yep.
It's excluded. So it's not included in those studies. But in terms of planning, longer-term planning, in the IRPs that I've gone through, which again, of course, are not cutting edge, but the result of the last few years' worth of work and tend to be behind the times in terms of expected amount of renewables and rarely included the Clean Power Plan, as new as it is. Storage tends to be considered and then eliminated from contention because combustion turbines are so cheap and gas is so cheap that it's cheaper to build more ramping and peak resources through CTs than it is through pumped hydro or compressed air or a chemical battery.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing in the IRPs I've reviewed. The only exception being the planning that's been done in California that I've come across a little bit, where there's a mandate for a set amount of storage. And so we've seen them incorporate that level of storage in the models, the dispatch models that get used. And it gets used quite a bit to manage the resources.
Thanks, that's great. So in thinking about these integration studies, how would you advise somebody who wanted to know how to utilize components of the vast literature that you guys have looked at? You've talked a lot about what's in these studies, what's not, what should be, what shouldn't be. How would you advise sort of the next stage of integration studies? How could we make them better? What should people be thinking about asking their states and ISOs, their utilities, to do better next time?
This is Tommy. I'll take a shot. It's really important to have the folks who really understand hourly and sub-hourly modeling and transmission on board. They've got to want to do this study, because it's that attention to detail that sometimes folks who are only thinking about high-level planning don't engage in. That's so important. And so you've got to have the right folks involved in this study to set up that difference. I think it's really important to model your system and the systems around you not as they exist in 2015, but as you expect them to exist in the future time period you're considering. What the Nebraska study did that I really liked, and maybe some of the other studies did too and didn't make it as explicit, is Nebraska said, hey, we're going to model a bunch of wind, but it turns out Kansas and South Dakota are also windy. So we're going to assume that the places around us also bring on a bunch of wind. And that distinction is really important, right? If Nebraska adds to their intermittent renewables, but the places around them don't, that's a different kind of integration cost expectation than if the folks around them do as well. And so setting up a reasonable future, and you can use sensitivities to help folks agree on what's included and what's not, but setting up a reasonable future is really important. And I think sensitivities are important. You're not going to be able to help it. You're going to do a sensitivity of the amount of intermittent renewables on the grid. You're just going to do it because folks are going to want to do it, and it's just too hard not to. And it's perfectly fine to do it. I think thinking about future transmission is a great sensitivity, about future inflexible units. How much coal is coming off your system? Are there nuclear units coming off your system? If so, how does that impact integration? And I don't have any idea how you could model improvements in regional coordination, but if you can figure out how to model that, by all means, throw that in there as well. Patrick, you got anything else for us?
Yeah, I think you hit on the exact points I would have hit. The thing that I would press people to really consider is push all the departments who are doing these types of studies to coordinate with each other. The people who are doing the integration study should work tightly with the people that are doing the planning and have a good sense of what the future is going to hold, because the integration cost today is interesting, but I think for these studies what's most important is the integration cost a few years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. So we have to think about what the system is going to look like, and changes to the retirement of old steam units or new transmission additions are going to make a big difference.
Great, thank you. That was a great wrap-up. So we are out of time, and in the interest of holding everyone to the hour that they allocated for this webinar, If we did not get to your question, I would encourage you to read the new report that is probably on our homepage right now. A solved problem, existing measures provide low-cost wind and solar integration. It may have the answers to your questions. And if it doesn't, feel free to reach out to either Patrick or Tommy, or really anyone here at Synapse with additional questions if we didn't get to them. And we want to thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at our future webinar on September 3rd, where we'll be talking about modeling the final Clean Power Plan rule. Thanks all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks very much.